I was following Big's lead on, like, we're going to do this peace tour. And, it didn't work out.
New footage from 50 Cent's explosive Netflix series has hit the streets, dragging viewers straight into the night Biggie's life was cut short. The frames hit hard, raising fresh questions, stirring old fears, and pulling the whole city back into the heat. Let's check it out. Biggie Unseen, the drive-by revisited. Yo, right out the gate, this one hit like a cold wind. Word spread fast that 50 Cent had a Netflix series out, a documentary that pushed a bright and rough spotlight onto Sean Diddy Combs. People had already watched headlines shift for weeks, but what froze everyone was the claim that Episode 3 carried footage linked to Biggie's passing, material nobody had ever seen on TV before. That claim rolled across clubhouses, barbershops, message boards, and street corners, and changed the whole mood in a single breath. Folks everywhere felt a strong pull, a mix of curiosity and that old familiar ache that never went away. Biggie's end stayed in the back of many minds like a loose tooth that never healed. The story of March 9, 1997, still read like a headline that refused to fade. Christopher Wallace sat in a car on Wilshire Boulevard. Then sudden gunfire broke the night. The city froze while a man loved across the world slipped away. That night brought more than grief. The streets burned for answers. So, when a high-profile series arrived with a promise of never-seen footage, the streets reacted with that same old tension that rose whenever someone reopened the past. People moved around with a quiet edge and tried to figure out what this new revelation might bring. The Netflix promos rolled across screens with the energy of bait thrown into the water. Viewers saw interview setups that felt like people were about to settle unfinished business. The promos carried more than a hint of truth-seeking. They threw out a challenge to the old guard. Anyone raised around stories like these understood how memory worked in the neighborhoods. It lived through the mix of what happened, what people believed happened, and what someone swore they had seen with their own eyes. So, once the series dropped hints about footage from that night, the rumor mills opened up like old wounds. Old theories rose from the ground like buried bones. People talked again about rival crews and the heavyweight of the East Coast and West Coast tension. Soon, feed after feed overflowed with new claims and fresh angles. But under all that noise lived something raw and human. The families felt the weight the hardest. For Biggie's mother and for the circle that stood with him long before fame. The idea of private footage landing on a streaming service felt like strangers digging through a family album and pinning the pictures to a giant billboard. That sense of invasion sent a cold shock through people who loved him. And the tension moved beyond a fight over who did what back then. It turned into a fight over who controlled the story in the present moment. By the time the first episode dropped, eyes stayed glued to screens, ears locked on every detail. The air felt familiar in a strange way. It felt like waiting for a fight to start, even though nobody wanted to see the hit land. Beneath the noise, one deep thought thumped inside every viewer. Maybe this series would finally push the case forward, or maybe it would tear old wounds open again just to chase views. The city braced for impact. History rolled back onto the screen, and in the streets, history never came soft. It came with teeth and it bit hard. The weight of decades pressed down again as people watched the mix of interviews, grainy footage, and street clips with heavy hearts. The city that once held its breath in shock now held it again for a different reason. Folks waited to see if this new lens would shift shadows or simply stir dust. And through it all, the memory of Christopher Wallace moved like a steady force behind every frame. The energy rose from the corners of Los Angeles to the blocks of Brooklyn. Everyone knew the story still lived. And once again, the world leaned forward and watched the storm roll in. The footage, when it finally arrived on the screen, drifted in like a ghost moving through a half-lit room. It looked grainy and uneven, cut from angles that forced your eyes to squint for clarity. But it carried its own strange truth, pulling viewers forward and making the whole thing feel more real than polished film ever could. In this documentary, those rough frames mixed with fresh interviews and with faces the public had not heard from in decades. Most of them had been walking around for 30 years with a heavy piece of history they needed to drop on the table and finally leave behind. In the streets, cars always tell stories, and on March 9, 1997, one car carried the weight of a story that would echo through decades. The Netflix series lays that night out like a hot bowl of soup. Christopher Wallace, known around the world as Biggie Smalls, rode through Los Angeles after a night that appeared routine. Then everything shifted into something sudden, brutal, and unforgettable. The series locks the viewer into the date, the city, and the precise small moments that cling to memory long after the footage fades. It refuses to let the viewer drift from the truth of those minutes. The filmmakers open the scene from the edges, using the margins to ease the viewer into the ordinary. Limos eased through neon reflections on cracked pavement. Groups moved in and out of hotel lobbies. Crew members drifted between rooms carrying jackets, equipment, and stray laughs. These human beats mattered because violence only shocks when it cuts into the ordinary. By laying out the simple pacing of a night that felt typical, the movie builds tension. The buildup becomes the stretch before something snaps. The cameras show the vehicles as if they were characters. A big black Suburban carried part of the entourage. A dark sedan held associates who tracked the pace of the night. The BMW held Biggie, settled into his seat, unaware of how short the rest of the drive would be. The camera lingers on the streets, the glow of a brake light at an intersection, and the muted gestures of people checking watches and phones. These gestures turn into a clock that counts down without notice. Each movement, each pause, each focus becomes part of a rhythm that is about to break apart. When another vehicle pulled up, the documentary tightens the angles. Grainy footage merges with recalled sensory fragments from eyewitness accounts. Then a window slides down, a shadow shifts inside the car, and a handgun appears, just long enough to mark the moment when everything changes. The series avoids anything theatrical. There are no exaggerated slow movements, no dramatic stutters in the frame. Instead, it leans into real sound, real motion, and real micro gestures. In no time, a faint mechanical click cuts the air. A sharp turn of a head shows instinct reacting before thought. The patter of shoes on pavement flashes through the background. These details transform the moment into something that feels lived rather than recreated, something that pushes the viewer deeper into the shockwave of the scene. Bullets had entered the car and Biggie was struck in the chest. That was when the chaos broke open without pause. The shooting is shown with heavy restraint and gravity. The filmmakers lay out what can be proved and what cannot. They reconstruct seconds using frames, documents, and interviews, placing the sequence into a grounded timeline. The series keeps clear that these are reconstructions built from available evidence and testimony, not embellishments. The physical reality is laid bare without extra shine. The noise, the movement, the sudden fracture of normality all build into a moment that refuses myth. After the shots, panic becomes the entire language of the frame. Doors fly open with frantic force. People scream without hesitation. The driver floors the accelerator, peeling the vehicle away from the scene like stretched rubber snapping free. Someone leans over Biggie, pressing a hand against a wound that will not stop bleeding. Someone else reaches for help in every direction. The rawness forms the anchor of the sequence, an anchor that grounds the viewer in the truth of the moment. It is not only about what happened, but about how human bodies responded when seconds mattered. The series follows the ambulance ride and the hospital rush with a steady hand, using medical reality to strip away any chance of fantasy. Doctors and medical records referenced in the documentary describe trauma to the chest and internal bleeding that surgical teams fought to control. The blend of clinical notes, hospital recollections, and the physical setting of emergency rooms adds a layer that feels both intimate and aligned with procedure. The framing keeps the moment rooted in the truth of flesh, blood, and lost time. The show then pulls back into the aftermath that spread through police departments, newsrooms, and street corners. Police reports were filed. Detectives replayed frames again and again. Rumors began to move through neighborhoods and music circles. The series lays out how footage can be contested, how context can shift the meaning of a clip, and how ownership disputes can complicate the search for truth. The fallout tied legacy, ownership, rights, and truth into one tangled knot that reflected the new reality of the era. Ultimately, the sequence gives no closure, only a reframing. By placing frames, names, medical facts, and movements into one complete shape, the film forces the viewer to hold the full weight of the night. Ordinary moments lead into sudden violence. Violence collapses into desperate action, and action dissolves into unanswered questions that stretch across years. The narration keeps its streetwise cadence, its sharp pacing, its insistence that memory never stays still. However, it leaves one truth on the table. Christopher Wallace was taken from the driver's seat of his life in a public and devastating way. The filmmakers hold tight to faces, movements, and the desperate decisions people make when fear and urgency collide. Sadly, the footage cannot heal, but scenes can push people to act and to keep remembering. The series keeps that pressure alive. The footage sits in people's minds as a painful beacon. It pushes the city and the world to keep looking until truth is found and until the families and the streets can feel a shift toward the answers they have waited for. Meanwhile, once unseen footage entered a story that had already been told a million ways, the old theories rose again like shadows stepping out from alleys. The city felt that familiar vibration, the kind that came when history stirred and breathed a little. People started thinking about the same old puzzle pieces, the same old faces, and the same old gaps that never closed. Names moved through conversations and stirred up old memories. Folks remembered the trigger, the silence, the paid favors, and the times when eyes drifted away at the wrong moment. Even though the documentary never created new suspects out of thin air, it brought attention back to certain names that always lived in the margins. It placed a spotlight on old meetings in dark corners, on movements that looked planned, and on stories hinting at contact between street crews and men in polished suits. That kind of mix always made phones ring deep into the night. It made people sit up in their living rooms, wake from half sleep, and start thinking about the story all over again. Inside the documentary, a few eyewitnesses stepped forward with accounts that pushed at small details. They described tiny mismatches in arrival times. They talked about a taxi route that did not match a security log written long ago. They commented on a camera angle that suggested another car stood closer than earlier reports claimed. None of these mismatches carried enough weight to stand as proof on their own. But in homicide work, details like that made detectives tilt their heads. And that tilt often marked the first step toward untying a knot that had held for years. As the series played across screens, reporters filed requests for old documents and searched for anything buried in the archives. They pushed for sealed records to be reviewed. Lawyers working for families asked courts to look again at case files left sitting for too long. A former federal agent appeared again, a man who had once followed leads tied to the case. Each realization added a small piece, a layer of recollection. In the age of the internet, recollection turned into record with speed. And once something became a record, it turned into a headline waiting to be shared. But on the block, theory did not move with that same pace. It followed a rhythm built from real life. People traded stories like cards passed from one hand to another. Some cards felt valuable, others felt cheap and counterfeit. There were whispers that the documentary pushed suspicion toward old enemies. Whispers that it softened certain names while sharpening others. But none of that slowed the re-examination. If anything, the noise pushed more men to step forward with memories they had held onto for years. In a place where tales lived long after the headlines faded, people came out to speak again. A new thought cut through everything else and lingered in the air. Folks wondered why the footage had stayed hidden for so long, but the answer stretched across many sides. Some clips came from private family recordings, material meant for home viewing and nothing more. Other clips came from security cameras owned by hotels or venues that never wanted to step into a decades-old storm. A few pieces were held by third parties who wanted distance from the chaos tied to the case. And then came the legal part, a maze built from rights and releases and paperwork that sat in boxes for years until someone bold enough and wealthy enough decided to open them. Stories stay buried not because they lacked value, but because opening them carried a cost that most people did not want to pay. The decision to bring everything out fell on Netflix and on the team working with 50 Cent. With that choice came a public reckoning. People who once lived as quiet archives turned into active figures in a story watched by millions. Frames that once belonged to private sources became proof played across screens. The release of the documentary opened new doors. Some people who had been silent for years suddenly remembered things with clarity. Their voices carried the tone of people who had waited for the right moment to speak and finally felt a path open. The city watched the whole thing unfold. Even though the footage did not solve the case outright, it carried the story back into the light, and light changed everything. Light could expose, light could clarify, light could force movement. And once light hit a place that had lived in shadow for decades, people started moving differently. For those who still looked for the truth, the documentary acted like a fresh road sign on a long path that twisted through years of confusion. For everyone else, it acted as a reminder that some nights held a city by the throat and never let go. After the cameras shut off and the streaming numbers rolled in, the real work started in the quiet places where people processed the weight of what they had watched. Families, fans, journalists, and cops all faced the same choice. They had to decide what they wanted to do with what the documentary put in front of them. The series had opened conversations in many places, but opening a conversation never meant closing a case, and the streets understood that truth better than anyone. They had lived with unfinished stories for years and carried them like weather. For Biggie's family, the footage lived as a double edge. It gave them a chance to look at certain moments with a new lens, to see angles they did not know existed. But it also pushed them into a sudden wave of press and speculation they never asked for. People gathered outside memorial spots with candles and flowers. They posted old mixtapes across their timelines. They shared long stories about the man before the legend. These human moments reminded everyone that behind the headlines lived a real man whose life had been cut short and who deserved more than endless theories. On the legal side, the renewed interest shook old rooms. Cold case units sometimes moved faster when the world placed eyes on them. But the system moved slow because systems always move slow. There were limits set by time itself. Evidence faded with age. A documentary could prod and publicize. It could raise a name that pushed a detective into a new lane. It could stir a feeling that made someone pick up a file they had not touched in years. But it could not force justice. What it could do was make the absence of justice very loud. Then the fallout between public figures grew louder. Diddy stepped forward and condemned the series. His team said parts of the series aimed to tear down reputations. They said certain footage had been pulled into the project without any real permission. Netflix stood firm and insisted they acted within their rights. That back and forth created a tug of war seen by millions. The dispute never felt like it revolved around a single clip. It revolved around the ethics of storytelling. It revolved around consent and the cost of broadcasting a life. Lines formed quickly, defenders stood on one side, and skeptics held the other. The whole thing turned into a modern fight ring where public memory and PR skills traded blows. People went back to old interviews and played them in slow motion. They paused at every corner of every frame and tried to catch details. That might change everything. For some viewers, Diddy's pushback looked like a defense of privacy and dignity. For others, it looked predictable coming from a man whose image and empire were tied to every narrative about that era. Either way, the conflict brought no real solution. So, the streets kept talking, because at the end of the day, the footage did what good archival images often did. It forced the city to re-examine a night it thought it had already filed away and cataloged. The documentary could shine a bright light on a single night, but the meaning of that light belonged to the people who lived through it, and the people who loved the man at the center of it all. The footage now existed in the world, and with it came a reminder that the city still remembered and still needed to keep looking.